You're listening to The Conversation. If you were the captain of a ship up to something nefarious in the high seas, it used to be pretty easy to get away with it. Our oceans are vast, far away, hard to regulate. But nowadays, satellites make it actually quite easy to see what's going on in international waters. For example, there's a website called Global Fishing Watch. Open that up and you'll see thousands of bright dots scattered across a map of the oceans. Each one represents a commercial fishing vessel. Zoom out and the scale of this becomes staggering. These ships are out on the high seas looking to catch things like tuna or sharks. But countless other endangered species, such as turtles, can accidentally make it into their nets, wreaking havoc on fragile ocean ecosystems and threatening biodiversity. Activities in international waters beyond countries' own national jurisdictions have never been fully regulated, until now.
The treaty's already been called historic. Awaited for years by ocean researchers and activists, 60 countries have just ratified it.
On January the 17th, a new UN High Seas Treaty comes into force, creating the legal framework to govern international waters. At a time of heightened geopolitical tensions, this is a rare moment when most of the world has come together in agreement to try and protect our oceans. I'm Gemma Ware from The Conversation, a news and analysis platform partnering journalists with academics. Welcome to The Conversation Weekly, where experts explain how we ended up here. In this episode, how the world arrived at a high seas treaty, but why it still leaves some big grey areas. Callum Roberts, you're Professor of Marine Conservation at the University of Exeter in the UK, where you focus on threats to marine ecosystems. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Callum, you've worked in marine conservation for a long time. Tell me, was there a moment that convinced you that the world needed to do more to protect the high seas?
I was awarded a Pew Fellowship, which began in 2000. And as my project, I started to research the history of exploitation of the sea. And what I did was to go back over 1,000 years in time and look at how people had affected the ocean by hunting and fishing. And what became clear is that we had literally been on a slaughtering, kind of mad dash around the globe over the course of the centuries, picking off the biggest, the finest, the most valuable animals from a very wide array of species. So things like albatrosses and elephant seals, whales, all of these things, big billfish, sharks, whatever it was, we had been out there after it and killing them. And what I realized was that this was not something that was safely tucked away in the past, but it was ongoing right now, and particularly in international waters, where with very little in the way of restraint or limitation by regulation, international waters were being plundered in the way that coastal waters had in the couple of centuries previously. And it's also extremely difficult to stop the kind of impacts spreading very widely underwater. And those impacts could end up affecting the climate. They could affect biodiversity. They could lead to deoxygenation of large volumes of deep sea waters. It is highly risky activity. So that was the point where I thought we have really got to get to grips with protecting the high seas.
How significant are the high seas generally?
Most people don't realize just how big the high seas are. And if you look at the international space, the shared international waters, they cover 61% of the area of the ocean. But when you take into account the third dimension, which is depth, the international waters occupy about 3/4 of the living space on planet Earth. So this is an enormous space. And the fact that things are going on in this space with very little restriction and with a great deal of destruction going on means that we have to pay close attention.
So now a new high seas treaty is coming into effect on January the 17th. Tell us, what does it do? What's it going to change?
Until now, most of the management that takes place in terms of high seas extraction, fisheries essentially, is done by regional fisheries management organizations, which operate under the aegis of the United Nations. Now, like most fisheries managers, they care very little about ecosystems, habitats, or non-target species. They're very invested in managing the stocks of the species that are being exploited. So animals like tunas or sharks. And that's why the United Nations eventually came to see that there was a need for another instrument that would offer protection to biodiversity in international waters. And that's what the High Seas Treaty is intended to do. It's filling that legal hole, which will allow from here on the creation of marine protected areas in international waters. It will provide a framework for assessing the impacts of industrial activities in international waters. It will provide a mechanism for sharing the benefits from marine genetic resources that are discovered in international waters. And that benefit sharing is going to happen across all of the countries on Earth, not just those with a vested interest in extractive use, for example.
And these marine conservation areas, they're kind of like national parks, but for the parts of the ocean that don't fall under any sovereign jurisdiction. Are there any targets that you think are first on the list that are going to get marine conservation status?
There are some very high priorities. For example, there's a place just off Central America in the Pacific Ocean called the Costa Rica Thermal Dome. And this is an area where you have upwelling of cool waters that pushes up towards the surface, and that promotes supply of nutrients into the sunlit surface water where plants can grow, and that plant growth then fuels food webs that sustain many marine megafauna. So, sharks, dolphins, whales, turtles, the like of which concentrate and congregate into that region. And of course, wherever marine life congregates, it also becomes very vulnerable to being exploited.
Can you walk me through how the High Seas Treaty came about, and also what role you've played in this history?
I came into this in the early noughties, about 2004 or so, when Greenpeace invited me to work with them to create a tentative map of areas worthy of protection in the international space of the sea. And at the time, it was felt that there wasn't enough information for us to make good choices about where to protect. And I think our purpose in creating this report was to say, well, actually, we do know quite a lot about the high seas. We do know what the nature of the seabed is across large areas of the ocean. We have a pretty good idea about how wildlife uses some of the ocean space. In fact, going back in time hundreds of years, the whalers who were operating in the 18th and 19th century, they knew where all these aggregation sites were for whales. And those aggregation sites are very closely aligned with areas of higher ocean productivity. So, the first oceanographers were actually the whalers of the very early industry. And we showed that we do know quite a lot about it, and we presented our results at the Conference of Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity. The UN started paying more attention, I think, not just because of our report, but because of others who were also seeing that high seas wildlife was being depleted and destroyed very fast in pretty much unmanaged fisheries. And so the United Nations initiated a series of meetings, which eventually led to a series of formal meetings at which the treaty was negotiated. And those formal meetings took place over the course of about 3 years or so, and then finally resulted in a treaty that was open for signing in 2023. And that has been ratified really remarkably quickly, I think, showing how important that many countries of the world consider this treaty to be.
And it's part of the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, which is an existing convention that's been around for a long time. So it slots into an existing part of the UN system.
It does slot into the Convention on the Law of the Sea, and that came into force in 1994. And the thing about the Law of the Sea is it already has provisions for protection of habitats and responsibilities. If you're going to exploit animals on the high seas, then it's also your responsibility to manage and protect them properly. But there was no mechanism in there, no legal instrument that enabled that protection to be provided adequately to that wildlife. And so it's essentially a piece that is added onto an existing mechanism, which is almost universally accepted and signed up to by nations of the world.
So One of the big areas, and you've mentioned this, where why you're interested in this is around fishing. But fishing, it's a bit of a grey area, isn't it, in the way that the High Seas Treaty treats it. Why is that?
Well, one of the things that was necessary to proceed with the creation of this High Seas Treaty was to make sure that the treaty did not compromise any existing agreements in international waters. For example, there's the International Maritime Organization that controls shipping. There's the International Seabed Authority that is responsible for exploitation of the seabed. And so the High Seas Treaty has to be mindful of and respectful of those existing agreements. And at the moment, as far as fishing is concerned, the management of fisheries is by these regional fisheries management organizations. They've proven themselves, many of them, to be very bad at managing even the target species fisheries that they're supposed to, and much worse at preventing damage to the marine environment, ecosystems and habitats and endangered species. To put the fox in charge of the henhouse, to put those management organizations in charge of creating protected areas, I think would be a mistake.
But that's not what you'd favour. You'd favour some other mechanism.
I would favour some other mechanism that created a body whose focus was biodiversity protection and who would implement marine protected areas alongside the fisheries management regulation. And that way we could have a serious body that is dedicated to conservation, working to protect biodiversity, and we could have regional fisheries management organizations working to improve their track record on sustaining and managing fisheries.
I mean, it's a daunting task, being asked to police, as you say, international waters. It's a large area. Even these marine protected areas might be quite large. So there's got to be a lot of thought put into how this actually happens and how you'd stop people fishing in those areas.
There does have to be a lot of thought. And it's one of those things where international law has a weakness, that there is no global policeman, if you like. The United Nations is not the global policeman. What it does is it sets the regulatory environment, and then countries are responsible for implementing the rules on their own citizens. But one of the reasons why there's so much lawlessness is partly because some countries don't take that responsibility seriously. And at the moment, there is no sanction for that, really, and no effective sanction, at least. And then other vessels are choosing to flag themselves to countries that are essentially selling flags of convenience, as they're called. And small island nations in the Caribbean, for example, will sell you a flag that you can then operate under their umbrella and operate in a very irregular legal regime. Basically, those countries don't have the resources to track and monitor the activities of the vessels that are flagged to them. And so there's this kind of loophole, and we need to close that loophole. And I think that the High Seas Treaty will, in a way, be breaking new ground for international regulation, because at the moment, what we have doesn't do the job effectively.
Another area you mentioned there is the seabed. And there is a lot more interest in the last few years about seabed mining from some companies, particularly US companies, and doing this in international waters because there are some particular nodules on the seabed which are rich in minerals like manganese, nickel, cobalt. This isn't covered necessarily by the High Seas Treaty, and yet it's kind of one of the hot issues of kind of international waters at the moment. Could it potentially fit into the agreement in some way?
This is how it should fit. And that is that if a protected area is established under the High Seas Treaty, it should become a no-go area for deep-sea mining. I happen to think that all of the high seas should be a no-go area for mining because we don't need the resources anyway. We've got enough proven reserves on land to fuel all our needs for decades to come. And so, what should happen is going to be, I think, the alignment of protections. But what is happening is that there is non-cooperation going on between this organization and others. And that has to be sorted out if the High Seas Treaty is going to be effective.
81 countries have now ratified the High Seas Treaty. Another 64 have signed it and are committed to ratifying it. But there are some big players missing, including Russia and the US. More on what that might mean after this short break.
Hiya, I'm Katie Edwards, and I'm a health editor at The Conversation.
I'm Dan Baumgart. I'm a lecturer in health and life sciences at the University of Bristol, where I also work as a GP.
And we work together a lot, and we try to explain weird and wonderful things about the body. And now we're teaming up to host Strange Health, which is a new video podcast from The Conversation.
So each episode, we're going to be taking a health trend going viral on social media.
You know the kind of thing. Drink chlorophyll to make sure you don't stink.
Do you really need to detox in January?
Have a supplement to make your bum look better. All that kind of thing. Each week, it's going to be me and Dan, plus an expert, who are going to thrash out between the truths and the myths.
You know, me being an anatomist, I was like, oh, can I have a look? And it was huge.
The liver is amazing. It's probably the only organ that can regenerate itself completely.
And we're calling it Strange Health because we're not scared of disgusting things. Episode 1 arrives on the 20th of January. So follow us on YouTube or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Callum, the fact that the High Seas Treaty is coming into force this month, it's being heralded by marine conservation organisations around the world. But are there any countries that are against it?
Unfortunately, there are some countries that are very invested in exploitation and are less enthusiastic about the High Seas Treaty. I think it's fairly obvious to most observers that countries like Russia and China have come along with this process reluctantly, and it's to be hoped that they will follow the rules and will support the efforts of the treaty that are agreed by the parties to that treaty.
So the US signed the treaty under the Biden administration back in 2023, but it's not yet ratified it, and it might be difficult to get it past the Senate. Does that make it meaningless?
No, it doesn't make it meaningless. In fact, the US is not a signatory to the International Convention on the Law of the Sea, but it complies with virtually all of its provisions. And so, although the US has given itself the option to do things that it'd be doing, or other countries think that shouldn't be going on, it hasn't exercised that option as yet. Although, of course, Trump has issued an executive order essentially giving the green light companies to go and mine in the deep sea in international waters. And that, of course, if it happened, would be an area which would very much test the global mechanism for management of the ocean. And we'll see where that takes us. But at the moment, the US has been a law-abiding member of the international community when it comes to the ocean, but nothing is guaranteed with the US anymore. You know, it's hard to hide what you're doing in the high seas now because vessels and their activities can be tracked very effectively from space. And there is a transparency now over what countries are doing. And if you know what people are doing, then you can apply international diplomacy to try and prevent harm from being done. Of course, we're in a difficult time geopolitically across the planet, and we'll see how this all pans out.
We are in a difficult geopolitical moment, but this is still arguably a good news story, isn't it, for international cooperation and this kind of vaunted rules-based international order that people kind of mourning the loss of in some ways. But at this moment when it feels really under strain, how significant do you think the High Seas Treaty and the fact that it's coming into force really is?
I think it's very significant, and it will be an interesting test of our ability to collaborate and cooperate together for mutual gain and protection of the planetary environment. That's something which we have to do in the future. If the human civilization is sustainable over the long term, we have to collaborate and cooperate to bring climate change under control, for example. And acting individually at the cost of the many is going to become a deeply unpopular thing for a country to do. So I think this will be a test of our ability to move in a cooperative direction. But it's been difficult in Antarctica, where the Convention for the Conservation of Living Antarctic Marine Resources has been in place for a long time. And it's a bit like Groundhog Day every year when the Commission meets and proposals are tabled for marine protected areas in Antarctica, and then they're swatted down because there's no agreement from Russia and China. And so there is a provision to avoid that kind of thing under the High Seas Treaty, and that instead of requiring full consensus by countries to move forward with conservation proposals, we will be able to just proceed with a majority decision. And therefore, I'm hopeful that progress can be made swiftly under the High Seas Treaty because that consensus is not going to condemn it to being ineffective for the future.
What are the next steps now this treaty is coming to force? What's going to happen next? What should we be looking out for? And what will you be looking out for?
There will be a meeting in April, the first meeting of the Secretariat of the treaty, and they will start bringing together all the rules of procedure, figuring out the structure of committees and technical bodies and so on. And then the first conference of parties expected to be hosted late in 2026. And that's the point at which the real business of implementing the treaty will come into being. And from that point on, I would hope to see very rapid progress being made.
Callum, that's been really fascinating overview of where we've got to. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of The Conversation Weekly. You can read more about marine conservation and the High Seas Treaty on theconversation.com, and we'll put some links to further reading in our episode show notes. This episode was written and produced by Mend Mariwani and me, Gemma Ware. Mixing is by Michelle Macklem, and our theme music is by Nita Saal. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter too by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you like what we do, please consider supporting us at donate.theconversation.com for listening. Rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us. It really does help us reach new audiences. Thanks very much for listening.
I was saved by God to make America great again.
An autocrat loves a crisis. A crisis is the way that they mobilize their base.
While America is under invasion from within, we're under invasion from within.
He's testing the boundaries of what he can get away with.
We should use some of these dangerous cities as training grounds for our military, National Guard, but military.
We've asked 6 of the world's preeminent scholars how we can measure the make of an autocrat. It's a recipe of sorts, tried and tested by the most infamous leaders in history.
Hugo Chavez in Venezuela.
Vladimir Putin in Russia.
Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler.
Viktor Orban in Hungary.
He's basically bulletproof in terms of criminal prosecution.
Join us from December 29 as we explore Trump, the making of an autocrat, from The Conversation.